welcome back to the next instalment of this Relaxed Regency project. I've had a little break from this series, so if you're in need of a refresher, I will leave a link to the playlist with the rest of the videos here. In the last video, we completed the bodice and the sleeves for the 1820s dress inspired by Little Dorrit, and we are now moving on to the making and decorating of the skirt. I began by laying out and cutting the pattern pieces for the skirt. The pattern I'm using here is Laughing Moon 138. I bought the PDF version of the pattern, but it only comes in A0 file sizes, so you'll need to have the pattern printed professionally. I'll be honest, since discovering that this is a service offered by a local craft store, I will probably never be taping A4 PDF pattern pieces together because it saves so much time and energy. Once everything was cut out, I began marking up the pattern pieces using a tracing wheel and carbon paper. Here I'm transferring the markings for the pleats at the centre back. Some of them are quite faint as the cotton sateen I was using for this project was quite thick, so I went over them with my chalk pencil. Next I overlocked all the raw edges. I was constructing this dress like I would a theatrical costume, while the accessories and underwear were mostly hand sewn. This was mostly to save time, but also so the dress is easier to alter should I need to in the future. I joined all the skirt panels together, leaving a gap for the centre back opening. I pressed the seams open and neatened the overlocking threads by threading them back on themselves. The next step was to work on the padded hem. I decided for this project it would be easier to shorten the skirt from the waist if I needed it, as there was going to be a lot of skirt decoration. It's much easier to decorate a skirt hem when it isn't attached to the bodice, but that means you can't check the final length, and if you get it wrong, you'll have to remove and respace all that skirt trim. It's much easier to set the hem, attach the trim, and then make any adjustments at the waist. I did a sample of this padded hem using a blind hem stitch on the sewing machine, and it worked brilliantly and was really quick. However, on the actual dress itself, it wasn't anywhere near as successful, and I ended up redoing the hem by hand later. But with the hem in place, I could start work on the padded Rouleaux trim. I cut wide strips of bias from my skirt fabric and strips of wadding to pad the hem. This is just some polyester wadding I had in stash. I believe historically they used wool roving, but the wadding worked just as well. I was a little puzzled how to sew the fabric around the wadding. Should I make a tube and feed the wadding through? But in the end, I just overlapped the raw edges of the bias strips and overcast them down. Being cut on the bias, the raw edges wouldn't fray, and this stitching wouldn't be seen, so I decided not to overcomplicate things. I did have to piece some of the bias pieces together to get strips of bias long enough to make the swag design I was going for. I began by roughly pinning out my padded rouleau into these scallop shapes. You may remember from my last video how I talked about including lots of scallop shapes in this design to represent the ups and downs of the Dorrit family's fortunes, and this shaping was based on a fashion plate from about this era, so I like that it's both period and character appropriate. I created these padded bows to cover up the top of the scallops. I just freehanded a pattern piece until I was happy with them, and then cut the shapes out of the fabric and wadding. I needed 2 layers of fabric and 1 of wadding for each bow. With right sides together, I joined 2 bow pieces together, leaving an opening to be able to turn it right side out. I then tacked the wadding piece in place on 1 layer, then trimmed and clipped my seam allowances to turn the whole thing inside out, sandwiching the wadding in the middle of the bow. I then gave them a gentle press and slip stitched the opening shut. I did contemplate doing some sort of quilting design on these bows, but I actually liked how puffy and 3D they looked as it was, so decided against it. I then gathered the centre of each bow down and adjusted the volume so that the ends of each bow pointed downwards ever so slightly. A scrap of bias then got wrapped around the centre of each bow to hide the gathering stitches. This was just roughly stitched in place. Next, I returned to the padded rouleaux, finalising their placement and carefully measuring the spacing. I spent a long time carefully getting the lattice designs to be perfectly even. Next, I pinned the padded bows into position and trimmed off the excess rouleau. Then all of this got slip-stitched into position along both sides of the rouleau. It took forever, and I did most of it on the sofa in front of the telly, so I didn't film it. With all the decorations sewn on, it was time to pleat up the skirt ready to attach to the bodice. I carefully pinned the pleats in place following the chalk markings and then basted them. I then pinned and tacked the skirt to the bodice. I'm using a heavy duty thread here as the skirt is so heavy. I did a fitting at this point to check the length and it was actually just perfect, which was surprising seeing as I am only 163 centimeters tall. If you are blessed with height and you are making this pattern, you will probably have to make the skirt longer. I then machined the skirt in place. Press the seam open and herringboned the seam allowance of the bodice down to the bodice lining. Looking back on this, I'm not entirely sure why I did this. Maybe to reduce bulk at the waist or for a little extra support? I'm not sure. I could then begin adding the fastenings at the centre back. I used trouser hooks and bars for strength and ease of closure. At this point, the dress is technically finished, but I wanted to make the matching belt. I cut and pressed a layer of white cotton and purple sateen and stitched piping to the edges of the purple sateen piece. Then with right sides together and using my zipper foot, I stitched the white lining to the main purple along one edge, stitching as close to the piping as I could. I'd learnt my lesson about trying to bag out this fabric and piping combination, so I left one edge open so I could turn the belt right sides out more easily. I graded down the seam allowance and clipped the corners before pressing under the raw edge of the lining and slip stitching it in place. Then one last giant hook and bar for the belt closure was added and we're done! Only not quite. For the day walking dress look, I wanted to add a detachable pelerine. I drafted my own pattern for this and cut 2 layers of the sateen. I also cut a long strip to turn into a pleated ruffle. I had to join several strips together to get the ruffle to be long enough. I hemmed one edge using the blind hem stitch on my machine. I could have hand sewn it, but I needed the speed at this point as the foundation's revealed competition deadline was fast approaching. I then pleated the ruffle down with box pleats to the correct length. I used the grids on my cutting mat as a rough guide to keep the pleats even, but I had to cheat a few to get things to match up. I tacked the pleats in place along the sewing line so that I could more easily attach the ruffle to the pelerine. I chalked on the sewing line for one half of the pelerine and then pinned the ruffle on with right sides together. I machined this one before adding the second layer of the pelerine. Oh, it looks like I tacked the ruffle on before sewing it. I'm very impressed. Good job, past Claude. I then added the second layer of the pelerine, again right sides together, and machined through all the layers. I graded down all the seam allowances with pinking shears to help imitate the effect of clipping the curves. I then turned the pelerine right side out through an opening I had left at the centre back of the outside edge. Everything got a good press to make the edges lie smoothly. I then slip stitched the opening up and added a ribbon tie. Is that it? Are we done yet? Oh no, of course not. There's one very important detail left to finish. The butt bow. When I look back on this butt bow, it is a bit of a damp squib really. It needs to be bigger and perky, but it was such a last minute addition, I think I can forgive myself for that. It's just some tubes of leftover fabric sewn into loops and arranged to look like a bow. I just tacked it on at the end of the belt. And now, finally, the dress is complete. Of all the parts of this outfit, the skirt decoration is possibly the bit I am most proud of. It was fiddly and time-consuming, but so worth it. I really feel that it looks historically accurate. Of the two looks, I think I prefer the day look with the long sleeves and the pelerine. I don't know, I think the silhouette just looks more balanced with the wide ruffle of the pelerine. let me know which you prefer. It's been quite a while since I finished this project, but I love it just as much as when I first finished it. There is one more video to come in this series, which is the making of the bonnet, but then we shall be leaving the Regency era for a little while. I have really enjoyed doing something more historical here on Retro Claude. So while I know many of you have subscribed for the mid-century vintage sewing content, I am hoping to do some more historical sewing projects too. Don't worry, I'm still going to be doing plenty of vintage sewing and knitting, but it is nice for me to take on these bigger, more challenging costume projects. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to make them into little series, so there will be regularly scheduled vintage content, and then every once in a while we'll have a historical series like this one. So let me know what you think. Are there any historical eras I should try? Obviously, bear in mind that anything I make has to be compatible with mobility aids, so unfortunately panniers and farthingales are out of the question. And look out for the video about the bonnet, which should be coming your way soon. So all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching. See you next time.